She traced my chest and whispered, "You're too hot for your own good." And just like that, everything changed. The first time she appeared in my life, it was one of those ordinary afternoons that somehow feel slightly off the usual rhythm. I had been lounging on the balcony of my apartment, the late afternoon sun warming my shoulders, when I noticed her standing across the courtyard. There was something about the way she moved, deliberate, fluid, almost effortless, that made me pause. Her hair caught the sunlight, long strands falling past her shoulders in a way that seemed both natural and deliberately elegant. She wasn't loud or flashy. Her presence was quietly commanding, the kind that draws your eyes without you realizing it. I told myself I was just curious. That curiosity, however, quickly grew into something more complicated. She had this way of observing her surroundings that suggested she noticed everything, but she didn't stare, she simply absorbed. And then, somehow, her gaze found mine. It was brief, almost accidental, but I felt it like a spark brushing across the skin. My chest tightened in a way that felt entirely out of proportion to the encounter. I immediately looked away, embarrassed by the awareness of her attention, but it didn't leave me. Not even when she turned and walked inside, the soft click of her heels fading into the apartment complex. The next moments were small, seemingly insignificant. A door opening, a laugh drifting through the hallway, the occasional brush of her hand against mine when passing by in narrow corridors. Each contact was fleeting, yet the memory lingered, leaving a warmth in my chest and an awareness I couldn't shake. It was physical without being overt. Her proximity had a subtle gravity, pulling my thoughts in ways I wasn't used to. I noticed the scent she left behind, faint but persistent, something floral yet grounded, like sunlight on warm stone. There was also the quiet, internal struggle. She was older than me, more experienced, more poised, and part of me kept reminding myself of that, of the social expectations, of how absurd it might look if I let my curiosity grow into something more. And yet, the fascination persisted, twisting around my thoughts. I found myself replaying those small moments in my mind, the way her sleeve brushed my arm, the tilt of her head when she smiled at a neighbor, the casual sway of her movements, as if she were choreographing them for no one but herself. By the end of that afternoon, I realized this wasn't simple curiosity anymore. There was an unspoken energy between us, a quiet awareness that both intrigued and unnerved me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it lingered in my chest like a persistent hum. The kind of sensation that makes you wonder if someone has always been there, hiding just out of reach, and yet you never noticed until the very moment they appear. That was the first time she entered my world, not with a bang, but with a delicate, persistent pull that left me both nervous and awake, aware of every sound, every movement, every heartbeat that might be hers. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew one thing: things were about to change. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. One day, I found her leaning casually against the railing outside my apartment door. She smiled, a small, knowing curl of her lips, and there was a warmth in that smile that made my chest tighten. It wasn't overt, not a full-on flirtation, but there was a deliberate curiosity in her eyes, as if she wanted to see how I would react. And I noticed, instantly, that I was reacting. My thoughts scrambled, my usual composure slipping in ways I hadn't anticipated. She had a way of making ordinary moments feel charged. Passing in the hallway, she would brush lightly against my arm, lingering just a second longer than necessary. That second was enough for me to feel a faint pulse of heat where our skin had met. Or when she caught me reading on the balcony, she would perch herself nearby, not close enough to be intrusive but near enough that I could feel her presence, almost like the air around her carried a weight. The sound of her laughter, the tilt of her head when she noticed me watching, it was subtle, playful, teasing, and it drew me in more than I wanted to admit. There was banter, too, the kind that was light and teasing but layered with an intimacy that felt dangerous. "You really think that shirt suits you?" she asked one afternoon, tilting her head as she scrutinized me with mock seriousness. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but the warmth creeping up my neck betrayed me. "It's fine," I muttered, my voice suddenly too loud in my own ears. She chuckled, A soft sound that lingered longer than it should, and I realized she wasn't just noticing me physically. She was watching me in a way that suggested she understood me, in a way few people ever did. Her physical presence became a language of its own. A casual touch on my shoulder while joking, a hand brushing past mine when she handed me a package. It wasn't about the contact itself, but about the awareness it provoked. I felt exposed and alive in ways I hadn't expected, aware of the warmth of her skin, the faint perfume that clung to her, and the quiet steadiness in her movements. Even the way she leaned slightly closer when speaking, enough that our shoulders brushed, sent a small thrill through me. It was deliberate yet gentle, a teasing invitation I didn't know how to refuse. Internally, I wrestled with my reactions. She was older, more confident, more experienced, and that made every glance, every touch, every playful comment feel amplified. Part of me questioned if I should pull back, keep my distance, resist the pull. But another part, the part that watched her laughter linger in my memory, that felt the faint spark when our hands touched, wanted nothing more than to lean in, to see just how close this connection could grow. By the time the evening shadows fell across the courtyard, I realized I was no longer just noticing her. I was attuned to her, to the rhythms of her gestures, to the subtle playfulness in her eyes. It was more than curiosity now. It was a quiet fascination, a pull that made ordinary moments feel heavy with unspoken tension. And deep down, I knew that this teasing, playful closeness was only the beginning. Something unspoken was stirring between us, fragile yet undeniable, and I couldn't ignore it even if I wanted to. It happened one evening when the golden light from the setting sun spilled across the living room, casting long, warm shadows. I had been helping her move a stack of books from one shelf to another, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same volumes. The air between us felt thick with something unspoken, a quiet awareness that had been building for weeks. I tried to focus on the task, but the subtle energy radiating from her made concentration impossible. She paused, a small smile tugging at her lips, and tilted her head as she studied me. "You've been working out, haven't you?" she said softly. There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity, admiration, and something that felt dangerously close to something more. Before I could answer, her hand reached out, tracing lightly over the fabric of my chest. Her fingers moved with an almost careless delicacy, as if testing the contours without intent, yet the effect was immediate. I felt heat bloom under her touch, a warmth that wasn't just physical but emotional, stretching through me in a way that left me both nervous and exhilarated. Her gesture lingered, and I noticed the subtle control in her movements, the way her fingers brushed, paused, and traced again, careful, deliberate, yet intimate. It was teasing without being invasive, a moment that straddled the line between playful and personal. I swallowed hard, aware of the faint brush of her nails against the fabric, the smooth glide of her skin, and the quiet steadiness in her touch that made my heartbeat quicken without any overt intention on her part. "I think you're too hot for your own good," she murmured, her voice low and calm, yet loaded with an emotion I couldn't immediately define. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I froze, feeling the tension stretch between us like a taut wire. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a statement that acknowledged the strange, unspoken awareness we had developed, the pull that had been building quietly, week by week. I wanted to step back, to reclaim the composure I usually held, but I found myself rooted in place, captivated by the gravity of the moment. There was no rush, no overt sexual intent, just the lingering connection of two people fully aware of each other in a way that went deeper than ordinary interaction. I noticed the small details, the tilt of her head, the warmth of her palm, the softness of her gaze, and each one left an impression that seemed to settle under my skin. After what felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat, she withdrew her hand slowly, her fingers brushing mine as she did. I felt a hollow ache where her touch had lingered, a mixture of longing, curiosity, and exhilaration. She stepped back, smiling lightly, and the room seemed emptier in her absence, though the memory of her touch remained vivid and warm. That moment marked a turning point. It wasn't a confession, nor a declaration of desire, but it was undeniably intimate. I realized then that the playful teasing, the lingering glances, and the subtle touches had built to this single, potent instant. It left me both exhilarated and uncertain, aware that the quiet fascination we had cultivated was now something deeper, something that demanded acknowledgement, and something I couldn't easily forget. The moment had passed, and yet it lingered in my mind like a faint echo I couldn't shake. I found myself pacing the small confines of my apartment, fingers brushing against the edges of the furniture almost absent-mindedly, my thoughts looping over and over the way her hand had traced my chest, the warmth of her touch, the quiet intensity in her gaze. It was a simple gesture, yet it had left a mark deeper than any words could describe, stirring feelings I hadn't anticipated. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it had been playful, harmless, just one fleeting moment. But my chest tightened every time I replayed it, and I couldn't ignore the flush creeping across my skin at the memory. There was a tension between us now, an invisible thread connecting our awareness, and it both thrilled and unnerved me. I kept turning the moment over in my mind, imagining it again and again. The softness of her fingertips, the subtle curve of her smile, the deliberate yet delicate way she had drawn near. And then came the hesitation, the quiet internal battle I hadn't prepared for. She was older, more experienced, someone whose life seemed already full and complete in ways mine felt still fragile and uncertain. The age difference wasn't just a number, it carried with it weight, a social perception, an unspoken question of whether I should even be thinking like this. Every logical part of me whispered to pull back, to guard my heart, to keep the fascination at a safe distance. But another part, the part that remembered the heat of her hand, the easy confidence in her presence, rebelled quietly, insisting I pay attention, insist I notice. Even the simplest things began to feel charged. The sound of her voice in the hallway, the faint scent of her perfume drifting past my apartment, even the rustle of her clothing as she moved, all of it seemed amplified, layered with an intimacy I couldn't fully explain. I became hyper-aware of my own reactions, the quick impulse when I thought she might glance my way, the lingering warmth in my chest, the way my fingers tensed involuntarily whenever I imagined her near. I realized then that this hesitation wasn't just about external judgment. It was about control, about understanding my own desires and what they meant. I questioned whether I could navigate this attraction without overstepping, without turning something subtle and beautiful into something complicated or regrettable. And yet, even as I asked these questions, I knew that the memory of her touch, the quiet acknowledgement in her words, had changed me. It had introduced a vulnerability I wasn't used to, a softness, a receptiveness, a quiet longing that had taken root in the most unexpected way. By the end of the evening, I understood something crucial. This was no fleeting curiosity. It wasn't a simple crush or passing intrigue. It was the beginning of something deeper, a tension between caution and desire, hesitation and fascination, reason and emotion. I didn't yet know where it would lead, or whether it could ever find resolution, but I knew that the pull she had created, the subtle, deliberate, intimate awareness, would not be ignored. Not by me. After the tension of that afternoon lingered in my chest for days, the next encounter with her felt different, calmer, yet heavier with an unspoken understanding. It was one of those evenings where the light softened everything, filtering through the blinds in warm golden slats. I was sitting on the balcony, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea, when she appeared again, standing just outside, hands resting lightly on the railing. This time, there was no playful teasing, no deliberate brush of her fingers. She simply watched, quiet and steady, as if she were considering something far beyond the moment. I felt my chest tighten the instant our eyes met, but instead of turning away, I stayed. There was a weight to her gaze, a subtle invitation to linger, to stay in the silence with her. It was a strange comfort, the kind that makes your body relax even when your heart is pounding. She leaned against the railing, close enough that our shoulders brushed slightly, a contact so light it might have gone unnoticed if I wasn't hyper-aware of her presence. And yet, the brush left a ripple through me, a quiet reminder of the connection that had begun weeks ago. We didn't speak at first. Instead, there was an exchange of small glances, subtle movements that carried meaning. Her fingers traced idle patterns along the railing, her eyes occasionally lifting to meet mine, and I found myself captivated by the rhythm of her gestures. Each motion seemed deliberate yet effortless, like she was sharing a part of herself without words, inviting me to meet her in that quiet space. I realized I was studying her every movement, not out of curiosity, but because I wanted to understand her, to see the vulnerability hidden beneath the poised exterior. When she finally spoke, it was soft, almost hesitant. "Do you ever wonder if people notice the little things about us?" she asked. Her voice carried a gentle vulnerability I hadn't heard before, the kind that made you lean in closer without thinking. I nodded, realizing that yes, I had noticed every fleeting smile, every casual gesture, every touch that lingered longer than expected. She smiled at my response, a small curve of lips that seemed to carry relief, as if she had been waiting to hear that someone truly saw her. Our conversation deepened naturally, touching on dreams, fears, and small confessions we rarely shared with anyone else. The balcony became a cocoon of quiet understanding, and the distance between us shrank, not physically, but emotionally. When our hands accidentally brushed again while reaching for the same cup of tea, either of us moved away. Instead, I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her touch, and the unspoken reassurance that she was present, fully aware of the fragile space we were sharing. By the end of the evening, I realized this connection was something rare. It wasn't about grand gestures or overt declarations. It was about presence, awareness, and trust. The warmth lingering from her touch, the calm in her gaze, and the comfort of her voice had created a bond deeper than I had expected. In that quiet vulnerability, I sensed the beginnings of something profound, an intimacy that didn't demand answers yet, but promised a future built on understanding, subtlety, and the slow, careful unfolding of emotion. By now, the quiet connection we had forged was no longer fragile. It had become a living, pulsing presence in the spaces we shared. Every glance, every small movement, carried weight, and the tension between us had evolved from fleeting curiosity into something more profound, something that neither of us could entirely name yet. The age difference, which had once felt like a barrier, now seemed more like a delicate thread weaving our experiences together, each of us aware of how different our worlds had been, yet strangely aligned. It was during a weekend afternoon, in the middle of an unassuming errand at a local bookstore, that the subtle confessions began to surface. She leaned across a stack of books to point something out, and for a brief moment, our hands brushed. It was accidental, or so it seemed, but the warmth radiating from her skin ignited a familiar tension in my chest. I felt the quiet pull of her attention, the way she lingered just slightly, the gentle curve of her smile that suggested she knew exactly what effect she had on me. "You notice things others miss," she said softly, almost a whisper, as if sharing a secret meant only for me. Her voice carried a warmth that settled into the hollow spaces of my awareness, leaving me both exposed and comforted. I realized that her comment wasn't just about observation, it was an acknowledgement of intimacy, a confession in its own quiet way. My pulse quickened, and for the first time, I didn't want to mask my awareness. I wanted her to see it, to know that I had noticed her too, in every subtle gesture, every fleeting glance, every soft brush of her hand. We continued through the bookstore, and our paths kept crossing, hands occasionally brushing against a book or a shelf, shoulders nearly touching as we leaned to examine a title. Each contact was fleeting, yet it carried meaning, an unspoken dialogue written in touch and glance rather than words. When she paused to examine a painting in the small gallery section, I noticed the way she stood, the tilt of her head, the quiet serenity in her posture. I wanted to tell her how captivating she was, how her presence had shifted something in me, but the words felt too direct, too bold. Instead, I let my gaze linger, hoping she would read the sentiment between the lines. Later, as we walked through the park nearby, our conversation turned to smaller, personal details, childhood memories, fleeting regrets, and the little joys that shaped who we had become. When she laughed at something I said, her hand brushed against mine again, and this time, neither of us moved away. It was a quiet affirmation, a confession of sorts. We were aware of what was growing between us, but we didn't need to rush it. The intimacy was in the pauses, the gentle touches, the understanding that something unspoken was taking root. By the end of the afternoon, I realized that romance didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, whispered in touches and glances, in words that carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Her presence, her acknowledgement, had become a quiet confession in itself, one that drew me closer, not just physically, but emotionally, leaving me both exhilarated and contemplative. And I knew that whatever we were beginning to share, it was real, deliberate, and waiting to grow at its own measured pace. By the time the week had drawn to a close, the tension and curiosity that had defined our interactions had settled into something steady, quiet, and unexpectedly comforting. The playful teasing, the lingering touches, the stolen glances, all of it had coalesced into a connection that felt intimate without needing to be dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no sudden revelations, just a profound sense of understanding, a shared rhythm that neither of us had consciously planned but both of us recognized. That evening, she invited me to her apartment to help organize a few things she had been putting off for weeks. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the space enveloped me, the soft glow of the lamp, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of fresh coffee, the quiet hum of life in the background. It was familiar now, this proximity, yet it carried an intimacy that made my chest tighten and my thoughts momentarily scatter. We moved through the apartment side by side, reaching for the same book or stack of papers, our hands brushing lightly each time. There was a comfort in the contact, a reassurance that neither of us needed to force the connection. It existed naturally, quietly, beautifully. She paused near the window, catching the fading sunlight in her hair, and looked at me with a softness I had rarely seen before. I felt the familiar pull in my chest, the warmth that had become so familiar over the past weeks. "You've changed my evenings," she said quietly, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. It wasn't a declaration of love, nor a confession of desire. It was something deeper, acknowledgement, trust, and a subtle invitation to share the quiet intimacy we had built. We spent the next hours sorting through books and small objects, sitting on the floor amid stacks of paper and dust motes, floating in the golden light. Our knees occasionally brushed, our shoulders touched briefly, and each time, it was electric and grounding all at once. The physical contact was simple, everyday, yet charged with meaning. It said more than words ever could. I noticed the small details, the curve of her smile when she concentrated, the tilt of her head as she laughed at my jokes, the calm steadiness of her presence beside me, and I realized that the attraction wasn't just about physicality. It was about the comfort, the understanding, and the quiet thrill of being seen and appreciated by someone extraordinary. As the evening drew to a close, she offered me a seat near the window, and I sat beside her, close enough that the warmth from her arm brushed against mine. We didn't speak for a long moment. The silence was soft, gentle, and full of the kind of intimacy that comes from shared understanding. I felt the ease of it, the steady heartbeat of her presence next to mine, the quiet acknowledgement that we had arrived at something rare, a connection built slowly, intentionally, and with care. When I finally rose to leave, she brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, her fingertips lingering for just a second longer than necessary. The gesture was tender, deliberate, and charged with meaning, a gentle closure to the week, yet a promise of more. I stepped back into the night, aware of the warmth that remained in my chest, the quiet thrill of knowing that our story was no longer just a series of moments, but a slow-burning bond, steady, mutual, and entirely ours. By the time I returned to my apartment, I understood that the slow build, the hesitation, the teasing, and the vulnerability had led to something far more meaningful than I could have imagined. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was real, human, and beautifully complete.